It is worth noting that the obligation to celebrate the Lord's feast still exists even after Christ's death on the cross. Any claim to the contrary is not in line with the teachings of the Apostle Paul, who emphasized that this obligation still stands. In his first epistle, the apostle encouraged the Corinthians to continue observing the feast even after the death of Christ. It would be hypocritical of Paul to ask the church to keep the feast when he does not. In Philippi, Paul observed the Passover feast and the 7-day feast of unleavened bread. The Passover was observed on the 14th day of the first month. This was followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread from the 15th to the 21st of the same month, totaling 8 days of feasts. The following is an excerpt from the Acts of the Apostles, page 390, paragraph 4.
At Philippi, Paul tarried to keep the Passover. The Philippians were the most loving and true-hearted of the apostles' converts, and during the 8 days of the feast, he enjoyed peaceful and happy communion with them.
Therefore, we conclude that the feasts were not abolished with the cross, as Paul continued to observe them. So then, what was done away at the cross? The following 2 paragraphs from the book The Acts of the Apostles will provide us with the answer.
The success attending the preaching of the gospel aroused the anger of the Jews anew. From every quarter were coming accounts of the spread of the new doctrine by which Jews were released from the observance of the rites of the ceremonial law, and Gentiles were admitted to equal privileges with the Jews as children of Abraham.
It is apparent that the Jewish community was not pleased with Paul's teachings about the ceremonial law, which was abolished with the death of Christ. The ceremonial law included the practice of offering animal sacrifices, which symbolized the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. However, the reality of Christ's sacrifice made the symbolic ceremony unnecessary. It's important to note that the feasts were not abolished along with the ceremonial law. They are separate and distinct from the ceremonial law.
Paul, in his preaching at Corinth, presented the same arguments which he urged so forcibly in his epistles. His emphatic statement, "There is neither Greek nor Jew, circumcision or uncircumcision," was regarded by his enemies as daring blasphemy, and they determined that his voice should be silenced.
The Jews who were skeptical of Paul's teachings were further driven to put an end to his message by resorting to silencing the preacher himself.
Upon receiving warning of the plot, Paul decided to go around by way of Macedonia. His plan to reach Jerusalem in time for the Passover services had to be given up, but he hoped to be there at Pentecost.
Paul had originally planned to be in Jerusalem to observe the Passover feast, but he altered his plans after discovering a conspiracy against him. As a result, he spent 8 days of the feast with the Philippians and then headed to Jerusalem in time to celebrate the Feast of Weeks, also known as Pentecost. In Corinth, Paul argued that the ceremonial law was no longer valid after Christ's death on the cross. Therefore, he suggested that we should celebrate the feast without the need to offer animal sacrifices. These sacrifices were symbolic and were no longer necessary after Christ's death. So, should we keep the feast? The answer is yes, we should keep the feast. Therefore, let us keep the feast.
Come, brethren and sisters, to these sacred convocation meetings, to find Jesus. He will come up to the feast. He will be present, and he will do for you that which you most need to have done. Your farms should not be considered of greater value than the higher interests of the soul. All the treasures which you possess, be they ever so valuable, would not be rich enough to buy you peace and hope, which would be infinite gain, if it cost you all you have and the toils and sufferings of a lifetime. A strong, clear sense of eternal things, and a heart willing to yield all to Christ, are blessings of more value than all the riches and pleasures and glories of this world.